Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today I want to show you an advanced EQ tool called Dynamic EQ that can really help you out of tricky situations. Today we're going to use it to fix a bass that is working 90% of the time, but every time one particular note is hit, it's just really overwhelming. This EQ allows us to turn down that one frequency band each time the one note is hit, while retaining the tone of that frequency for the other notes, so we don't cut out something that doesn't need to be cut out on other notes that it might sound good on. We'll also use it to add warmth to a vocal without letting it get muddy and address some harshness from some S's. But before we get into it, a quick disclaimer: this is an advanced mixing tool that is not nearly as important as just basic EQ. If you don't feel fully confident with EQ, then you should go check out my video explaining EQ that I'll link above. And for anyone watching this video, you should definitely grab my free EQ cheat sheet from the link in the description below. EQ is the first tool you need to master if you want to create professional sounding music, and the EQ in GarageBand is awesome. This EQ cheat sheet just walks through everything you need to know to really understand and use EQ. So be sure to grab that from the link in the description below. But let's get crazy and start talking about some dynamic EQ. Okay, so dynamic EQ is somewhere between a compressor and EQ. It gives you dynamic control over each band of the EQ that will automatically adjust based on the volume of the incoming source at that specific frequency. So for example, in this case, we have a bass that's just really overwhelming when one particular note is hit. So let's listen to it in the context of the mix without this plugin on, and then I'll show you in solo and you can really hear what I'm talking about.
Dreamed of living alone and to travel, but she's so far from home and she kinda unraveled. All the while in the dangers of an American smile, she said, I wish you were here and we'll be next time.
So you might be able to notice, if you're really zoning in on that bass, the first notes that are played in the progression are just kind of overwhelming compared to the other notes. Now we can see this pretty easily if we look at our channel EQ here with the visualizer. It's right around 64 Hertz. It just bumps up way higher than the other notes. Check it out.
She dreamed of living alone and to travel, but she's so far from home and she kinda unraveled.
So the other notes are down here compared to all the way up here.
She said, I wish you were here and we'll be next time.
So we can really see visually what's going on here. And we could cut out just that one frequency on this EQ. And at first I thought that would be enough, but over time I started to feel like I was losing some of the low end tone from other notes because I'm constantly notching at that frequency. And there's other tone from each other note that's being played in that same frequency range. So I don't necessarily want to fully cut it out all the time. What a dynamic EQ is going to allow us to do is just cut it out when that note passes a certain threshold. So it's kind of like a compressor and an EQ smashed into one. So there's a compressor built into each of these individual EQ bands, and every time the sound crosses a certain threshold, the volume will be turned down at that specific frequency band. So if we listen to this bass in solo now with this TDR on, you'll notice that this band is going to just dip down every time that first note is played. Check it out. So it doesn't affect the other notes, but then when that first note is played, right? Pretty cool. And we can actually go a step further. This plugin has this cool feature where if we hit gain reduction delta, this is only going to play the sound of what's being turned down. So check this out. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so let's put on a fresh version of this and I'll show you how exactly I set this. We'll go down here to the TDR Nova. Again, this is free, so you can download this right now. And I already know from my graphic EQ, because I don't get a visualizer on the TDR Nova, I know from this EQ that it's right at 64 Hertz. That appears to be where that frequency is really hitting. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this band here and I'm just gonna set the frequency to 64 Hertz. And you can also actually solo this band. So if you're still trying to figure out what frequency is bothering you, you can hit solo, find the specific frequency that's bothering you, and then start to set the dynamic portion. So we're gonna make this a lot more narrow because we really just wanna catch that one note. So something like that. Take it out of solo. And now what we can do is we can turn on the threshold, which is going to engage the compressor part of this plugin. and I can just bring this threshold down. You can see how loud it gets around the knob there. I can bring this threshold down to where it's starting to turn down every time that note is hit. And then what I recommend is finding that place where the threshold is only going to really catch that one note, at least for an example like this. That's the only thing you really want this EQ band to be affecting. And then once you have your threshold set, you can dial in your ratio and your attack time. So the ratio is just going to be how extreme it is. If you want it to turn down even more every time it's hitting, then you can use your ratio to kind of scale that up to be more extreme. Right, so we can make it really extreme here. So it's still not turning down for other notes, but when that one note hits, it turns down quite a bit, right? So if you need to turn down more, I would use your ratio for that. We're gonna keep it around 4, 3.5, 4 for this bass. And then you can set your attack time. This is gonna be how quickly it engages. We want it to come on pretty quickly, so we're gonna set it to 5 milliseconds. And that's also going to make it more intense in terms of how much it turns down. And then we're going to set a really slow release time. We're going to try to time it with the notes so that as it releases, as it turns back up, it's closer to in time with how long each note is. That looks pretty good to me there. I think it could be a little bit longer. Yeah, let's make it a little bit longer actually. Right? And now we're balancing that note a lot. And if you find that this sounds a little bit weird, if this is maybe working a little bit too hard, you could scale your ratio back so that it's not going to be as much compression. And then a cool thing here is that you could actually add in a cut at that frequency as well. So I can use this gain knob to just turn down at that frequency. And then I could do kind of best of both worlds where I'm doing dynamic and a little bit of a notch so that it's always turned down a little bit, but it's not going to be as drastic as what we had to do on our channel EQ. I think on that EQ, I was doing 11 decibels. Yeah, about 11 decibels of a cut. What we can do with the TDR Nova is get 11 decibels every time that note is hit, but we can do it in conjunction. So I'm only actually turning down a couple decibels consistently, but then every time the note is hit, I can turn down an additional 10 decibels or something in that range. Okay, let's look at this on a vocal really quick, kind of doing a slightly different thing. So on this vocal, what we've set is an EQ bump down in the low mids, and we can actually listen to that in solo here.
Living alone and to travel, but she's so far from home and she kinda unraveled.
So this frequency in itself is adding warmth to the vocal.
She dreamed of living alone and to travel, but she's so far from home and she kinda unraveled.
But at times it just started to get a little bit muddy. So by setting this threshold, I was able to cut it back when it started to get too muddy, but still have it adding some of that low mid information at other times. So we're kind of having our cake and eating it too. We're cutting out the mud when it's getting muddy, but we're also adding in warmth when we want warmth. Unfortunately, those frequencies are kind of in the same range. And so sometimes you might need a little bit more body to your vocal, but if you just do an EQ bump, then at times it's not going to be working. You can automate this with a basic EQ if that makes more sense to you, but something like this can kind of do it all in one, which is really cool. Okay, the other thing we did is essentially de-essing with this vocal. So sometimes you get a more natural de-ess sound, by which I mean literally reducing the amount of S sibilant sound that is in his vocal. Sometimes you get a more natural de-essing sound if you do it in stages. So here we have sibilants, which is Waves de-esser. It's really, really great. Highly recommend it. And then I'm also doing a little bit of sibilant cutting with this TDR Nova. Check this out here.
She dreamed of living alone and to travel, but she's so far from home and she kinda unraveled.
Pretty cool, right? And we can listen to just what's being turned down there. Pretty cool, right? And then again, to find that frequency, another neat feature of this plugin is that you can select it and you can solo this band and really find where exactly you're hearing that S. You can also see this visually on another EQ. So if we pull up our main EQ, I usually use this to find my starting point with any de-essing.
She dreamed of living alone and to travel, but she's so far from home.
So you can see it popping up right here, right around 8,000 hertz, just below and slightly above it. So I can then go into the TDR, start in that frequency range, and I think I ended up here, around 8.3. And that's really working well and cutting out some of that sibilant sound. So you put it in the context of the mix, and now your vocal has a lot of warmth and body, but it doesn't ever get muddy, and you can reduce kind of the harsh sibilance of the S's in one plugin really easily.
She dreamed of living alone and to travel, but she's so far from home and she kinda unraveled. All the while in the dangers of an American smile. She said, I wish you were here, we'll be next time.
Now again, I just want to reiterate, this tool is super powerful, but it is only going to be helpful if you really understand EQ to begin with. If you really understand how EQ works and what's going on in EQ, then you can really use this plugin to its full potential. So if you don't already have it, be sure to grab my free EQ cheat sheet from the link in the description below. It walks through everything you need to know to get started with EQ. It's really going to help you out. Be sure to grab that. Before we go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever heard of dynamic EQ? Do you use it in your mixes? I know one of our viewers, Sean, really loves dynamic EQ and specifically this plugin. So Sean, shout out to you. But let me know in the comments below. Have you ever heard of it? Have you ever used it? If not, are you going to download it? Are you going to try it? Let me know in the comments below. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.